This episode of the Personal Finance Show is sponsored by no one, for now anyway. Until then, I ask that you please support the show by visiting my small business website, financialaccounting.ca, and my product review website, awesomedeals.ca. Financialaccounting.ca is Canada's bookkeeping and accounting hub. There you will find interviews with accountants and companies that want to help you with your small business finances. And if you want to learn how to do your own basic bookkeeping, you can hire me as your bookkeeping coach. I'm a QuickBooks Pro advisor. AwesomeDeals.ca is where I write reviews of products and services I've used and really like. If you click on the links in my reviews and buy the awesome products and services, I make a little bit of money. So check out these sites, and if you do, maybe we can keep the Personal Finance Show sponsor free.
This is the Personal Finance Show.
Hi, I'm Bo Humphreys, and this is the Personal Finance Show. Barry Choi wasn't always a personal finance expert. Back in his 20s, he didn't know anything about investment fees or what he should be investing in. But when someone suggested that he might be paying more than he needed to, he quickly found out that it was even worse than he thought. That incident from 10 years ago kicked Barry into high gear and created the personal finance expert we know him to be today. Barry is also one of Canada's leading travel experts and blogs about his travels and various personal finance topics on his site, moneywehave.com. Barry has been published in the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Financial Post, and MoneySense magazine, just to name a few, and he's made many appearances on Canadian TV over the years. Barry joined me in Toronto to tell his personal finance story.
The earliest memory, there's so many growing up as a kid. I think the first formal memory is getting my first bank account.
Yeah.
At the time, it was a national bank, but what they had, which was unique and really appealed to my parents and myself, was if you signed up for this children's bank account, whatever it was, you got a free subscription to Owl magazine.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if you remember that.
Was that the same as like Chickadee?
It was.
Same
now
sort
that I
of
think about it, I don't actually know if it was like a National Geographic Kids, but it must have been something like that.
something similar, right?
Yeah. Owl magazine. It's like, every month you get this magazine, talks about animals. I don't even remember how old I was. Must have been like 6 or 8.
I think we totally got that magazine, yeah.
Yeah, so, kids are into animals at that time.
Awesome.
And more importantly, the concept of, you put money into the bank and then they pay you interest, which is funny when you look back at it now because that doesn't exist anymore.
I know.
Right? So it's weird because the fact that I was getting paid money, even though it was, I don't even remember what the interest rates were, but that I could actually see money in my account.
Well, they were high in the 80s.
Yeah.
This is 80s, right?
Yeah, it would be in like the mid to late 80s.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But it's funny because it was like a noticeable amount, right? Like if you think about it, I probably had a few $100s, but I was still getting like $1 or so a month. So you're right, you do the math. You're just
Awesome.
like now it's insane. I can have literally tens of thousands of dollars in my adult bank account, and I'll get zero for it. In fact, I have to pay them.
Yeah, you might get $1 a year.
Yeah. So what makes that interesting is the fact that it really encouraged me to save my money.
Well, where'd you get the money? Where did you get this first money?
Well, the money, as a kid, it's really just allowances, birthdays. There's really not much you can do with it. So at a young age, you kind of get that idea where you need to save for certain things, right? I think that's my earliest memory for me, myself. And obviously, my parents, they're immigrants, so they taught me about the value of money quite early. We weren't poor, but at the same time, we weren't rich. More importantly, I never got everything I wanted, which I think is pretty normal for most kids.
Yeah, well, not everything.
Yeah, but at the same time, you see tons of kids where they're just, spoiled isn't the right word, but, maybe their parents give them more. And that's fine. I remember, it'd be Christmas or whatever, you come back from school. You come back to school after the break.
Yeah.
And the kids, everyone's talking about the loot they got.
Yeah.
Or whatever, which is cool, right? And then...
But if you don't have any...
Well, no, I think everyone gets stuff, and I got always one present, usually whatever I wanted. It would be one present. It's funny at the time because you don't have a concept of how much certain things cost. So something you think you're asking for is a ton of money.
Yeah, one thing.
Yeah, it's actually not.
Yeah.
Whereas these days, you're asking for, like, kid asks for like an iPhone, like you're talking about $700.
Yeah.
Anyways, to backtrack a little bit.
Do they ask for iPhones really young these days?
I think they do, or iPads or whatever. So to backtrack, I'd go, it's like, oh, I got this one game, which was really cool. Like whatever Nintendo, Super Nintendo game. It's like, oh, it's awesome. I got this game, my next one's, and the really cool thing about that was, my birthday was a week before Christmas, so it was like I always got 2 gifts pretty much.
Perfect. Right? I'm glad they didn't lump it together.
Yeah, it depends. Some of the relatives did, but the parents didn't.
Okay.
Yeah, but then it's funny. You go back to school, and I remember talking to this one kid. He's like, "Oh, I got like 4 or 5 games," and you're like, "What?" Like you're so confused.
Yeah.
And then like you're so confused that they got so many gifts, and at the same time they're so confused that you only got 1 gift because it's only what you know.
Yeah,
right?
You don't know what their parents do or different philosophies on
exactly.
gifting.
And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just like you're just like, well, what? And to me, at a young age, it's just like I don't need like a lot of gifts. I got the 1 gift, and it was cool, right? And even now, I've got a kid now, and I spoke to my wife about it. It's like I don't want to get into the habit of getting her a ton of gifts.
Sure.
At the beginning, because she's young and we're new parents, like, okay, you want to buy her an extra sweater, get her some extra books.
Yeah.
I can live with that, right? But, when she's at the age where she can actually understand of, like, what gifts are, it's like, no, I want to do what my parents did. You get 1 gift.
And teach her that, like, if her friends got other gifts, well, people are in different situations.
That's
Don't compare yourself to the Joneses, right?
Yeah,
Even when you're a kid. That applies when you're a kid, not just when you're
And I can also
FOMO.
joke, in the future, since I work from home, like, my kid will have no idea what I do. Right?
That's right.
She's going to tell her friends, like, my dad sits at home all day.
Take your kid to work day.
Yeah, exactly.
What will that be like?
It'll be like,
go to the kitchen.
Yeah, exactly. Make me a sandwich.
Yeah, exactly. You'll be my assistant for the day.
Yeah. But it's funny, like her, I guess her teachers or whatever, her, classmates are going to think I'm a bum or something. Dad just sits at home all day at the computer.
That's good. You'll know the secret.
Yeah.
You'll have the secret.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have bought anything with this saved up owl money.
Wow.
Or did you? Or well, when do you remember when you first
here's
used
the funny thing about like saving money. I also clearly remember spending that money.
Oh, okay.
So growing up, like and you're talking about 8, 9, 10. There's not much you really need.
No.
Right. It's not like I'm going out to buy lunch or checking out the newest restaurants.
That's right. Which is what we spend a lot of our money.
Yeah,
on,
and even video games back then, it's like even though I was saving, I wasn't making enough where I could just buy a game leisurely.
Yeah.
Right. And by the time I had enough money, it usually was around birthday and Christmas when people were hitting me up with it not so much money, but the point is like I'm already getting a game, so I don't necessarily need like a new one's like, oh, I don't actually need to spend my own money. That being said, once you hit your teenage years, things change.
That's right. You got the priorities.
Yeah. I clearly remember like junior high and like a lot of these times like this is when things start to go up in price too, right? So I remember like I'm going to talk about video games a lot because that's what I did growing up.
Hey.
So a Nintendo, a Super Nintendo, my parents paid for those because they were relatively inexpensive. But then I remember when PlayStation 1 came out, it was like $300, and my parents couldn't believe it cost $300 to buy video games, and you only get 1 controller, and you got to buy the game separately. That to them was insane.
Premium stuff.
So immediately, I've got money because I had this money saved up over the years. So
I'm doing it.
Yeah, so that's where all my money.
That was your first. So you remember
first
that?
major purchase.
Was it PS1?
PlayStation 1 and the games associated. Like I would say, a lot of my purchases, even like when PlayStation, I think it was number 2 at the time. Can't even keep track.
Yeah, there are so many.
Yeah, I remember I had gotten a scholarship to college, but it was a scholarship given through my high school. It wasn't like a government scholarship.
So just like a gift. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a cash scholarship.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't use that for school. I mainly parents didn't even know I got a scholarship that came with it. I remember it was like it was a $400 check, and then like PlayStation 2 at the time was like $500, and it just come out. I was like, so this scholarship went right to the PlayStation 2. So it's good in the sense that I was still saving.
Yeah.
And then I was.
But you're spending at this point. You're 18 around this time when you got the scholarship.
Yeah, sounds about that. And at that time, I'm also working part time.
I was going to ask you, where did you work?
I just worked at a computer store that does not exist anymore.
Okay.
Just part time doing sales, and that was nice because it was one of those things where it's like, oh, I'm making this money. I can spend it on whatever. But that being said, the really nice important thing here is once I started making money, my parents really encouraged me to save that money to invest in RSPs. And in hindsight, you look back and you realize investing in RRSP at that age is not a bad thing, but at the same time, it's not necessarily a good thing because I was already in a lower tax bracket. So it didn't actually benefit me. You know, these days, right now, especially with tax-free savings accounts, if you're making part-time hours as a student, you're probably better off using your TFSA or whatever. So there's just better options. But that being said, the lesson taught is still very valuable. My parents encouraged me to invest in my RSP early, which I did, which set me on a good pace because I did automatic payments, you know, so I was constantly investing, and they taught me it's like, as you make more money, you should invest more. So, you know, as my hours, once I finished college, I didn't have a full-time job right away, but I was still making more money because it was part-time in my field.
No, we didn't have TFSAs at the time.
Exactly.
Right? And the alternative would have been to put it in something non-registered.
Well, I think the alternative at the time, like, you know, mutual funds still made sense at the time.
Yeah.
Right? Totally did. But I think even at the time, it's just to learn about fees and understand what you're paying. And I think at the time, there wasn't really many alternatives. It's not like I was going to be a stock trader when I was 16, 17, 18. You know, it was definitely the right choice at the time. You know, I think it's also other things that they could have done, and it's not their fault because they just didn't know. It's like encouraging me to learn about what am I investing in. So I clearly remember, and this is almost what led me down to the path of changing my investment strategy, is when I went to the bank, and they may not necessarily have as much knowledge, just say, oh, you should buy a mutual fund. Yeah. And they have no idea what they're recommending. They have some basic general bank knowledge and say, oh, well, this one did well.
They know more than we do, though. That's the thing.
At
That's
the time, yes.
At the time, yeah.
At the time, so they're like, yeah, you should invest in this, and because it did this well, X amount of years. But, you know, now I know better. It's like, well, just because it did well the last 2 or 3 years doesn't mean that's proof of future performance.
And not maybe worth the fees
you're
paying anyway. So, yeah.
Exactly. And, you know, the other thing I noticed that, you know, the bank, you know, you make an appointment every single year just to get a checkup. And they tell you how your investments are doing, but you realize they're just looking at a spreadsheet, right? They don't actually explain to you why. That being said, things have changed over years. I think the bank employees, as much as people crap on bank employees and their fees, I think they're way more educated these days because I think they've learned what consumers are looking for. And more importantly, they've realized that consumers are smarter, so you can't really BS them.
There's competition now.
Yeah,
there wasn't any back then. It was the bank or what?
Literally the bank.
You guess you're going to go to Edward Jones?
Yeah.
I don't know. Was that even around? It probably was around. Investors Group probably was around.
They were around, and so I was disappointed with what my bank was offering me in the sense that I didn't feel like I was a customer. You know, that being said, when I'm putting in $50 a month, $100 a month, what was I realistically expecting? But what happens is that creates an opportunity for other people to prey on people like me. Because, you know, I was disappointed, and then, you know, a salesperson comes around from an investment group where they can be like, hey, you know, I can give you better returns. I'll pay attention to you, blah, blah. Just put your money in with me. And you know, when you're at that age and you think it's a friend, you'll put your money into anything.
Sure, yeah.
Especially in my teenage years. I don't know about you, but there was quite a few pyramid schemes going on with certain financial products or certain items where they're like, oh, rule of 72 or whatever, and then you'll be rich in a few years. I can tell you right now, all of those people who were in those, you know, lines of employment are not rich.
I remembering investing in movies and getting tax breaks. That was one of the things back in the 90s. Because, you know, the rules around filming, they were giving people who filmed in Canada a tax break, right?
Okay,
so if you invested in that, you would also get the tax break. But you know how these things change all the time, right? A tax shelter is not going to be a tax shelter next year. And so these are the things, and it feels like kind of the Wild West, doesn't it? Like olden days.
Yeah, those are just, I wouldn't go as far as calling those investment schemes, but I sort of get it. But they try to convince you like, hey, invest in this, it's good for you. But I'm talking about straight up pyramid schemes.
Oh, the Bernie Madoffs of the world.
Yeah, they're not necessarily
the scammers.
True pyramid schemes. Like Madoff was more. You could argue that's a Ponzi scheme.
Oh, Ponzi, yeah.
Like a pyramid scheme is where you're at the top
and recruit people. That kind of pyramid
exactly.
scheme.
That was popular. But,
yeah, for sure.
You know, going back to my personal story, you know, I ended up changing to this investment firm, thinking that someone I knew would take care of my money because they were a friend. They would know how to invest.
That's right.
And more importantly, I didn't know any better. And then you realize that you're just tied into these high fees. But then once you're in, it's so hard to get out because, you know, there's deferred sales charges, front-loaded ends, back-loaded ends. There's so many different fees.
Yeah, we could talk about deferred sales charges because I know that was a big deal for you, and it was a big deal for me too. So, yeah, the idea is the salesperson or your investment person gets paid like upfront a little bit at a time, or
well,
as the years go by?
That's a front-loaded fee, and then there's the back-end fee. Deferred sales charges are basically if you invest with this firm, you cannot pull your funds out for 7 years, and if you do pull them out, there's a fee, and they can usually start at like about 6%, and it drops every year.
But the reason that they're charging you this penalty is because this is the essence the compensation, or for them or for the salesperson.
It is, but at the same time, they are still getting an MER, right?
So they're getting that too.
Exactly. It's just a way for you to not be able to pull out your money and keep it locked in.
But how did they justify? Has anyone ever justified a deferred sales charge to you?
Well, the hope is that you just don't move your money out, and if you're ready, you're going to be like, well, I'm already all in with you. I've been here so long. What's the point, right?
It seems so wrong, doesn't it?
Everything seems wrong, right?
I guess that's a good point. It's all wrong. But this one seemed like way worse to me. Like I can't even take my money out.
It can be interesting.
So you had went through the experience of taking your money out despite having to pay.
Well, it's funny because
did you wait?
What happened is I was really happy with this firm because the way they sell it to you is it costs you nothing.
Yeah.
My services are free. But I didn't know what an MER was. That was that management expense ratio we were talking about.
Yeah.
And it was never explained to me what this was. And that was the deceiving part. So, I used to frequent these message boards and people were asking, like, what do you think of this group? And I would say, hey, my investors with guys from there doesn't charge me anything. I'm so happy, paid way more attention to the bank. And I'm giving him this glowing review, not realizing what this person's actually doing.
I know.
And then what happened is this random stranger on the same message board messaged me and he goes, hey, just so you know, I guarantee you're being charged. I'm not trying to sell you anything.
Sure. Yeah.
But just, you should do your due diligence. Take a look. If you tell me your fund names, I will even send you the paperwork as proof. I was like, oh. It's the first time things ever be mentioned to me. So I looked into it. I gave him the fund names. He sent me the paperwork, and he's like, hey, you don't need to believe me. I work for someone else. I'm not trying to sell you anything. But call them if you don't believe me.
Yeah.
Or just do your due diligence. So I called this firm I was with. In case you're wondering why I'm not saying the firm's name, I actually have an agreement with them, which I'll get to in a second. And I said, can you confirm these fees? It's also the deferred sales charges and all these other fees that we're talking about. And then the customer service rep was not my investor, just a customer service person. Like, yep, this is what you would have to pay. If you were to leave, this is how much you pay monthly. And if you were to leave, it's going to cost you, at the time, it was about $4,000. If I want to pull out all my funds
your money,
because of the deferred sales charges. At the time, I think I was only maybe 2 years in.
Wow.
So I still had quite a few years to go.
Sure.
Right? So they did math, and it was $4,000 or $5,000, which is a fair amount, right? Like I was probably maybe 26, 27 at the time.
It's a lot to pay.
Yeah, that's like a huge amount, right? And keep in mind, at the time, I'm thinking about getting married, and I'm just like, oh my God, I can't afford to lose that much money, blah, blah, blah. So the next thing I was like, okay, so I had to ask my advisor, I'm like, what's going on? I thought you told me, there's no fees, and I just found out about this. You never talked about it. And at the same time, I'm researching things on my own, just about like
down the rabbit hole.
That's exactly what these fees are and how it affects you.
Once you know.
So the advisor didn't get back to me right away, and then when he did get back to me, it was all about like, if you're not happy with the returns, we can change the funds into something more risky. Ugh. And it had nothing to do with the question I was asked. And the weird thing is, I should have known better, but a lot of people don't. Like I talked about how this guy was a friend and he was an advisor. Well, what I didn't mention was he was the security guard at my former workplace, and that's how I met him. So it's like, you're like, oh, he's just changing careers. Mm-hmm. But in hindsight, you think about it, I don't know how far the lies go back, but he told me, he's like, oh, I used to like be an investment advisor, and I'm just taking a break, so I'm just doing this for now before I get back into the game. At face value, you just say, okay, sure. But these days, because I'm older, I would do reference checks. I would check exactly. I'd check this history with any person managing my money or whatever. A lot of people just don't do that. So what's interesting is I was ready to pull my money out because I did the math, and I was like, okay, it's going to cost me $4,000 or $5,000, right? But if I change the funds and I switch to a lower mutual funds with lower fees, it's going to cost me this much. So I was like, I'm actually going to break even.
Yeah. And you'll make it back probably in less fees
exactly, because you do math. It's like, I'm actually going to break even.
Yeah.
Right. But as I started to do the research, I hung on to all my paperwork, and I read the paperwork, and here's what got my advisor in trouble.
Oh, okay.
Reading the original statement plan, it said that one of my goals in the near future was to buy a home. Right?
Okay.
And for those people unfamiliar with that, buying a home implies that I needed the money short term.
Yeah.
Which means that my money should not be invested in anything high risk.
Or anything that's locked in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which locked in refers to deferred sales charges.
Yeah.
So I emailed his management team, and I was like, listen, I have proof. This is like, I need an explanation of why this advisor put me into this fund when it clearly says in his own words that I need this money sometime soon. Management took a quick look and was like, you know what? You're right. There's no explanation for it. You're 100% right. If you want, we can set you up with a new advisor. I doubt you want that based on the customer service you want. And so if you prefer, we'll give you back all your money, transfer to any institution you want. We'll waive all the fees. You just need to sign an agreement that you will never speak about this in public.
Wow.
And I haven't. So I will never name the company, but it's not hard to figure it out on your own.
There weren't that many going on.
Yeah, and even deferred sales charges only exist with a few firms.
That's right.
So it was funny that his boss right away sided with me. He's like, no, you've got proof, and we're not trying to fool you whatsoever. There's no explanation whatsoever.
So you got off without having to pay the deferred sales charges.
Exactly. And I knew a few other people at my office where I used to work who was also with them, same idea.
Yeah.
And I told them what had happened, and they started to look into it in very similar circumstances. And I found at a later date that my advisor had been let go from this firm because what happened is they did an investigation into him and realized that he was putting everyone in funds that did not make any sense.
Didn't understand.
Not that he didn't understand, but
was he doing it on purpose?
He was putting them into funds that made him money.
Of course.
Right?
Okay. Wow.
Right, exactly. In hindsight, you're just like, oh, of course, that makes so much sense now. So he was let go because it was so clear. And to be fair, the firm, that wasn't their mandate. It's just so easy for advisors to do that. The firm wasn't suggesting to anyone, oh, you should make yourself money first. It's just when you have that power, you're so tempted because it's like, oh, I can put them in a fund that makes me money right now, or I can put them in a fund that makes more sense for them that won't make me as much money.
Well, they're living exclusively on these commissions, are they not?
That's exactly.
So they don't have but maybe they have a little base salary depending on the company, depending on their situation.
Exactly.
But mostly it's like, this is their bread and butter, this is their living, and they're thinking in their head, well, I'm still going to make them money. What does it matter if I charge them a little more for this or that? That's probably the justification, right?
That's exactly the way I see it.
Yeah.
Right? So, yeah, it was funny that I found out later that he got let go. And it's weird because I ran into him on the street a couple years later. And I tried to be civil about it, shook his hand, just casual chit-chat, how are you doing, blah, blah, blah. Because, I didn't hold any ill will, even though he had basically tried to steal my money.
Yeah, wow.
And then he went on this rant, yelling, saying I had ruined his career, in public. He's like, I hope you die, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I didn't
really.
Oh, yeah. It's like,
his career of
being
taking
an
people's money.
Advisor. Yeah.
Like his career, which he was abusing his power.
Oh, totally.
People like to blame everybody but themselves, don't they?
Exactly. And then, when I look back, you realize there's tons of warning signs that I should have figured out, this isn't a legit person. I remember he had this laptop that never worked, right? And he kept blaming the office, but it never booted.
One of those IKEA prop
ones? It was a joke, right? It's like you could never do anything. No emails ever returned on time. Like one day I met with him. He had a cast on his arm, and he was like, yeah, my hand met someone's face I didn't agree with. And it's like, whoa. Why is my advisor, who's in his 40s beating people up? Exactly. So he claims, right? He's just trying to look tough or whatever.
Wow.
And I remember him, talking a big game, and it's like, yeah, my mom owns 3 condos or 3 houses in the annex. I live here, blah, blah. And I remember seeing him in a rental apartment, right? And it's just like, they're just talking a big game to sell you. And I believed all of it. Thank goodness that person messaged me.
Yeah, that's really, really lucky. But I mean, you probably would have figured it out.
No, I don't think I would have.
Really?
Why would I? It's like,
I mean, over time, right?
I don't know. It depends. It easy for me to say, but think about it. Unto that moment, I was perfectly satisfied with what this person was providing me, and I thought I was on the right track. I didn't know what asset allocation, what bonds, how MERs were. I didn't know any of that stuff.
I didn't know that stuff either. Yeah. Well, what year was this, by the way?
It's probably about 10 years ago, roughly.
So 10 years ago, yeah. So I didn't know any of this stuff, but when the robos started coming out, when ETFs started coming out, there was a lot more publication, I feel.
But even then, it's true. Like, yeah, I get that when robos came out, but you probably only looked because you had this interest in finance. Like, good point. Think about, I'm just continuing with my life. I'm not going to become this personal finance expert that I am now. Instead of reading about, the business section, I'd be reading about sports or whatever, right?
So that's a good place to go back in time to, you went to school for what?
Broadcasting.
So for broadcasting, and then you ended up working in broadcasting.
That's right.
For a while. Where did you start?
What do you mean? Like
what did you have a first job, or were you somewhere for a while?
No, What
was your first big job?
My first big job was at City TV, and I was there until just a few months ago.
Yeah, okay. Right. So and how long were you there?
Almost 20 years.
Almost 20 years. Yeah, and you're only 25, right? So,
yeah, something like that. No.
Yeah, how did you're so young, right? But you were there for a long time. And so that was your money making, and that's how you got the money to invest, and you were investing this money.
Yeah.
And was it only after this incident then that you started really getting into the personal finance space?
Yeah, that's pretty much it, right? Yeah. So after this incident, the good thing about that person who messaged me, I actually still talk to him on a pretty regular basis.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Especially because of what I do now, I quote him and we talk.
Is he a personal finance blogger or?
He's a certified financial planner in another province.
Oh, interesting.
So quite often when we talk, it's like just for fun. Like we're almost buddies. I've never met him to this date.
Like
but I talk to him on a pretty regular basis.
The night, the one that he was he saving other people too? I'm sure on the boards.
You would think so, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you're.
Yeah. I just started to learn. At the time it was actually really easy because right away. Tangerine was already popular. Tangerine was probably in the country about 10 years by then. They had just launched their investment funds.
It was ING Direct at the time, was it?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
It was ING.
Yeah.
They introduced this new product, and you quickly realized that it was like, at the time, it was like a 1% fee.
Yeah.
Which is 65% cheaper than mutual funds.
Yes.
And by that time, I had researched and understood what asset allocation was, and they did a pretty good job of explaining it also. Like, hey, they got different portfolios. If you're young, this is why you need to do it. At the time, by now, I was not married yet, but this was all my RSP money, and I had some other money. I hadn't understood that, hey, because I got the wedding coming up, I shouldn't invest this money, but I should use a high-interest savings account. I was already a client, blah, blah, blah.
Perfect, yeah. So they took the time to have that conversation with you.
That's right, even though it was all online, right? Like, it was right in front of your face. And that was the easy way. And that was just like a comfort zone. It was easy for me to transfer money or start investing this way. Mm-hmm. And then, about the same time, I was also learning about the Canadian couch potato and index funds, just learning about it, reading as many personal finance books I could get my hands on. At the time, I remember reading The Wealthy Barber. The original was one of the first ones I read. Mm-hmm. And then I remember reading Personal Finance for Canadians for Dummies, which was more like a Bible. It's really thick. People don't really think about it, but it's actually a great resource.
It's part of the Dummies series, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But it covered so many things. It was interesting. Sure. I don't think people give enough credit for the Dummies series.
Yeah, they have a lot of things in them, don't they?
Yeah. And then as the years passed, there was, I remember Rob Carrick's had a book. I don't remember the name of it. He's had like 3 by now.
Okay.
Preet Banerjee had a book. I also liked The $1 Million Teacher, but everyone talked about index funds. So by then I had switched over to TDE series. And then, the funny thing is it probably only took 20 hours of research to get into it. And it's so simple. But once you understand it, you realize when you read something else, how it all relates back. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very easy to understand how these things...
We're all talking about the same basic concepts, right? The asset allocation, as you said.
Yeah.
Low fees. And what else would...
even something like, if it sounds too good to be true,
it
probably is. I still laugh at people who are like, you're guaranteed an X percentage if you just give me X dollars. Like, oh, really? A guarantee? Yeah. Like, no, it's a scheme.
I did a little Bitcoin experiment just so I could tell people about it, right? Mm-hmm. Just so I could say, don't do this or do it. Like, just make your own choices, but here's the information, right? Because there's a lot of misinformation about Bitcoin on how it's like a sure thing and everyone's making tons of money. And like you said, whenever anyone says something like that, you have to really watch out, right? There's always a chance you're going to make some money. There's also a chance you're going to lose all of it.
100%, right? Yeah. Like you can make tons of money on anything. A good example right now is real estate.
Sure.
People over the last 10 years have made lots of money. The gains have been there, but the rules have changed where it was so easy back then to make money. But now the rules are shifting. That makes it harder. But it's funny because, obviously introduced some new rules with the stress test. So it's harder. Well, not harder, but you can't borrow as much.
Yeah.
Right.
Just to protect consumers.
Exactly.
Right?
To protect consumers is the key word. And rising interest rates have also made it more difficult for people to borrow as much. So it's two factors, right? But what's interesting is there's some people who have been kind of caught in it. They bought too much house and now they're
just before things changed, I guess.
Exactly.
Maybe, yeah.
So they can't get as much of a mortgage. And because rules have changed and people can't afford as much money, some new builds have gone down in price because it's supply and demand. At the time, everyone wanted to buy, so we charged this much. Now, not as many people are buying, so we've reduced the prices. But obviously, some buyers are on that contract. So they've been complaining to government saying, these rules are unfair. It's affected us. You should change them just for us because, we're hardworking people. We're not asking
just
for anything.
Us.
Yeah, which makes no sense. It's like, okay, so when you've made this huge mistake and you've signed this contract that you can't afford, you want a bailout. But I don't see you volunteering any of your gains that you got from your house sale in advance. Like, hey, you know what? I made too much money. Why don't I give some of that back?
Yeah.
Right. So I personally don't feel anything for people who get caught in those situations. And it sounds awful, but at the same time, there's a reason why I always tell people is like, make sure you know how much you can afford. And, I get how mortgage calculators work. The banks look at how much you currently owe, right? How much you're making, how much debt you have, and they spit out a number that says, okay, based on this, you can afford this.
Based on today.
Exactly. And there's nothing, it's not necessarily wrong.
It's always going to be like this.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But, it doesn't factor in, how much you want to save for retirement. If you're going to have kids, if you're going to take vacations.
Nothing.
Or even if you want to buy furniture for your home. And that's fine. Like, I don't expect the banks or anyone to do that. It's up to you to factor in. Like, banks can't predict what you want to borrow or what your lifestyle costs. And if they did and they offered you less, guess what? They know perfectly well that you're just going to go to the next lender.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
So everyone wants a piece of the pie, right?
It's a good time to mention that bankers are they're looking at your situation, they're trying to help you, but they also have a mandate to make money.
Oh, 100%.
That's their job, is to sell you financial products that make them money, right? I said this previously. If you have a credit card and you pay it off every month and you pay the balance and you never pay interest, you might be like, how do they stay in business?
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And it's because not everybody's like that. And you're right. People will just, oh, wow, you're going to give me this much money? Like it's a gift.
Yeah.
Like a mortgage is not a gift.
Yeah.
It's like a lifelong prison, especially if you can't pay it, or if your situation changes. What is it like? If somebody's situation changes by like 0.25% or something, or the interest rate changes,
it's crazy, right? We see stats like that all the time. They're like, oh yeah, I'm currently living not paycheck to paycheck, but they would be in distress if they missed a paycheck. Yeah. Right? And like you said, it's like, oh, interest rates go up by a quarter point and all of a sudden you're hurting. It's like, that sounds insane to me.
That's crazy because it's going to happen.
Yeah. It may not happen because obviously your term's locked in for anywhere, from 1 to 10 years. Most people have it at 5. But, what if interest rates have gone up 1% in those 5 years? All of a sudden it's like, oh, you can't afford as much. And it's weird because everyone these days just focuses on the monthly amount. I don't know if you remember, there was this very popular real estate show in Canada that had focused on a Canadian realtor. I won't mention her name, but every single episode she's like, just think about the monthly cost. Just think about the monthly cost.
Really?
Right? Yeah. And I get that as a realtor or whatever. And not everyone does that. Don't get me wrong. It's like, so she's like, don't think about it this way. Think about the monthly cost. So all of a sudden it's like, okay, yeah, it's going to only cost you this a month, but how about all the interest it's going to cost you by taking the longer term or whatever, right?
Or the alternative, compared to the alternatives, right? Maybe you could, a lot of people see houses as an investment, right? Or, which they shouldn't. But if you do, well, think about alternative investments that aren't maybe as precarious.
Yeah, and I'm a little bit more conservative if you think about it. Like, I remember when my wife and I were searching for a home, I'm not even kidding you, just the amount of money we had saved in our income, they approved us for $1 million.
Yeah, wow.
And
dual income.
Yeah, exactly. And
dual income, no kids.
This is a while ago before we even bought, and I literally laughed. And we only bought like a couple years ago, and it was nuts. It's just like, you want to approve me for that much money, and could have it been affordable? Yeah, probably. But like you said, like what we just discussed, I don't know if we've been able to afford having a daughter or taking vacations, or we could have, but something would have given. You know, if we had kids, that means, okay, no more vacations, no more eating out. Or maybe that means sacrificing your retirement. I'm sure.
Or you might have had to stay at your job
exactly.
at City for, that's longer, part of, whether you wanted to or not.
Yeah, a lot of people probably don't realize this. Like, I left my full-time TV job that paid very well and had huge benefits, paying pension, just so I could spend more time with family, and I took a huge pay cut, and that's fine. And you're right. Had I bought a more expensive home, I wouldn't have been able to do that. And I'm sure many people were in that same situation. That being said, had I taken that $1 million and bought $1 million home, that home might be worth $2 million now.
It might be, but hindsight, right? 2020.
Well, yeah, it might be, and I can't sell a room. You know what I mean? If I need to pull out some equity.
That's right. You're still living there.
Yeah, I can't sell my bathtub and be like, hey, will you give me, like, this room is worth probably $200,000. Can I sell you just a room?
That's the thing about a house, especially the one that you live in, is oh great, the value went up. What you going to do with it now?
Yeah.
You could likely borrow against it, which is a terrible idea. But if you needed money, that collateral equity is there.
It's true. Like when homes go up in price, it's doubled in price. Yeah, but you still owe $800,000 or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's good if your income's increasing, but that value is only good if you're selling it right now and you're moving to somewhere cheaper.
That's right.
So some of the boomers are selling their homes in Toronto that are worth a few $1 million, and they're moving out east or up north, where housing is 50% cheaper. Good on you.
Yeah,
you've made it.
Because they probably bought them for $250,000.
But at the same time, I know many people my age who bought homes that they were probably struggling to afford at the time, and on a monthly payments, they can definitely afford it on a monthly basis. But if anything changes, and at the same time, the same people are talking about is like, oh, I can't afford to take a vacation, or something, a life event happens, and life events do happen. They need the money, then all of a sudden they're struggling. Like you said, do they refinance their home? It's like, why? It's just like because they have no other options.
That's why it's always good to have a buffer, right? Mm-hmm. So you obviously know a lot about this stuff now, but when did you first start writing? When did you first decide to start writing about this stuff on your blog? When did this all begin?
I would say about not writing, well, about 6 years ago, then I got more active. Social media was starting to become more popular. I was really into Twitter. And Twitter at the beginning, you're kind of like, oh, what is this thing?
Yeah, what's happening?
What am I doing? So, going back to video games at the beginning, all I was doing was really tweeting about video games.
Yeah, sure.
It's like, hey,
tweet
guys,
what you like,
I'm playing Call of Duty right now. So cool, right? But I think that was literally my first tweet, playing Call of Duty. But then you realize there's all these other voices and some other people. So then I saw a few bloggers. I think Preet Banerjee was one of the first people I reached out to because he was like, oh, that's cool. I can kind of talk to this person that... By then, I had read his book. I had learned from him, blah, blah, blah. Listened to his podcast. Mm-hmm. And I just reached out, and we talked. And funny enough, I did a podcast with him probably 6 years ago, talking about very similar things. Around
that time. I'll look that one up.
Yeah. Talking about literally the exact same things. About the guy who saved me, about the investment firm. And him and I are actually buddies now because now I write about it. But, after I appeared on his podcast, a lot of the personal finance bloggers actually reached out to me. People I had never heard about because my story that I was telling them is exactly what they were trying to educate people on.
Exactly.
And then even back then, it's like, there's personal finance bloggers. Blogging was still relatively new. I thought blogs were for just people to rant about their lives or to talk about Japanese cartoons or something like that.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So it was really cool to add quite a few people reach out to me right away. And then I was like, they're like, hey, if you ever want a place to write and share your story, go ahead. So, we had talked about how I got my fees waived, those deferred sales charges. Mm-hmm. So I wrote a story about why I got that waived and talked about how it's based on the errors he made. And, we talked about signs that your investment advisor is a fraud. I talked about the broken laptop and broken.
Yeah.
I wrote that for another person, another blogger.
So is that first, you had a first post? Was that it on your site?
No, these are I basically all wrote for other people.
So how did Money We Have?
And then for my site, this is where I was getting to. It's like what happened is I mentioned I was at a TV station at the time. There was a lot of layoffs at the time.
Okay.
And as weird as it sounds, in television, when there's more layoffs and just the position I was in, I actually had less work to do. Because what happened is they got rid of a few shows and eliminated people, but those were shows I worked on, but my job wasn't eliminated because there was still 1 or 2 shows. So I actually had a lot of downtime. So I just started writing about finance on my own. I'm like, I'm just going to start a blog for fun, just to keep my brain entertained.
Sure.
So I wrote about, I just started writing about money because it's what I knew. And then, working in television, I kind of knew what people were looking for. I kind of knew what style to write, what angles to take.
That's the broadcast education and your experience.
Yeah, it was more the experience. Just I worked in a newsroom, right?
You've been doing this for at least, 10, 15 years
At
already?
the time, it was about 12 years there. I just knew, right? Like, I knew how to appeal to certain people. Like, at the time, the finance bloggers weren't necessarily doing certain things, but I knew how people wanted to consume media. So I took my background in broadcasting and just kind of applied it to a blog. And fortunately, it stuck. It seemed like people could relate to it, or at least the style, and made it very easy to understand. Because at the station I worked at, it was really about making it clear for how do I tell a story so everyday person understands. You look at the newspapers, some newspapers are more technical than others. But, I think I got in at the right time. There weren't that many bloggers, and I appealed to a certain demographic and people. And it was nice that a lot of the community knew my story.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, by then, so there's a lot of encouragement, right? Yeah. So, that's kind of how the blog started.
I mean, that's still how the personal finance blogging community is in Canada. Very encouraging.
Mostly.
When I started.
Yeah.
I got so much support. I met you. You were one of the first ones I met. You and Jessica and Sean Cooper on the same night. Right?
Oh, yeah?
At the Well Simple party.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And we never met before. And everyone was just so friendly and welcoming. And
mostly,
Jessica invited me on the podcast. You say mostly, we don't have to get into that. But I suppose there's a bad egg or two or a couple of conflicts. Some people have some strong opinions. Is that what you're saying?
People got opinions of personal finance bloggers. Some people like to do their own thing, which is totally understandable.
Sure, yeah.
And, I think some personal finance bloggers out there just don't give good personal finance advice.
Good point.
That's just me, right? Anyway.
Is it like recommending things like Bitcoin, that kind of thing, or going that way, or like
those are a few things that you could do, right? It's
Sure.
just giving certain personal finance advice that may not necessarily be the best advice.
Yeah.
But it's all subjective.
Well,
right?
yeah, read a bunch of blogs.
Yeah, we
right?
talked about Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And it's like, it could go up, but it could also go down.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're providing the information strictly for educational purposes, then that's fine. But if I read a personal finance blog that said Bitcoin is the future and it can only go up, I'd have a problem with that.
Yeah.
And it's no different from real estate. And you just got to see where the sources come from. Like, realtors sometimes. It's weird because, anyone can call themselves a personal finance expert. I got no formal training. I call myself a personal finance expert.
Yeah.
But if you're a certified professional, you have standards. You cannot make bold statements.
Yeah, that's right.
I remember my TV days. You can't just say some criminal is guilty, even if they were caught with the murder weapon in hand.
That's right.
In the victim, they still given due diligence, right? But with blogs, like anyone can say anything, right? It's a bit nuts. And then you got questions like, why are they saying certain things? And I get why. Like even like on my own site, I do affiliates. I do get paid work, but I disclose it quite clearly.
Yeah, you're not saying this is the only way to go because they're paying me, right?
Exactly.
You're giving your opinion, which is usually weighted both ways in one way or another. Like you're just talking about the reality.
Yeah,
of
exactly.
the
And some people don't believe that's possible. Some people believe that if you're being paid by a bank, you can't give an objective opinion. And I certainly understand why they might feel that way, but I think it also depends on the person you're talking to.
Yeah.
Right? Or the person, the advice they give. If they've got a proven track record of calling out certain banks that they've worked with, or pointing out what's flawed with certain things, I think that's perfectly acceptable.
I think the thing to understand, especially about your situation, and because you have sponsored posts more than I do, but the thing to understand is they come to you because they like your style, not because they're trying to buy you, right? They think that you're going to be able to write a good piece. And they want to promote a certain type of thing, right? Like a type of product or whatever. Not like, come buy it from us. but we offer this, but so do others.
Yeah, and then, like, there's so many things out there. I think it's crazy to suggest that some people think that, you can blame influencers for why the world is in debt or whatever, right?
Oh, wow.
Right? Because it's like, this influencer told me to buy this, so that's why. No, I don't do that because I could get sued for that.
That's right.
I'm very careful about how I word certain things, right? And even then, I'm still not guaranteed to be safe. Like, I could get sued for any reason here and there. I just like to put as many disclaimers as possible to make it clear. Or even when people, like, I wrote this post about how Bitcoin is taxed in Canada.
Yeah.
Just an explanation. But at the same time, I make it very clear that I'm not an accountant.
Yeah.
I don't work for the CRA.
You're just giving information.
You should check it. This is what I believe works based on my conversations with accountants, right? Mm-hmm. But again, I don't work for the CRA, and people will complain and be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. If I'm trading Bitcoins, why do I have to pay each time when I haven't cashed it in? It's like, well, it's a taxable event.
Yeah.
Each time you trade something, it's a taxable event. Like,
just because you haven't converted it back to dollar or
exactly.
Canadian
Well,
dollars.
I can switch mutual funds 100 times.
Right.
And I haven't converted it to cash, but each switch is
You're
still
buying
taxed.
and selling, unless they're in a sheltered RRSP
exactly.
or TFSA
so
type account.
You'll see people complaining, and then you'll just like, well, I have a friend who talked to the CRA, and they said it doesn't count. Well, that's great. Well, you know what? That's not good enough. But the point is, you put all these disclaimers, and you let people know, like, it's still up to them to make these decisions on their own to figure out, like, what's they should and shouldn't be doing.
But our goal is to try to provide more information or all of the information we can find, and we're just trying to help. Here's something that you might want to know about this, but then go read somebody else's. And yes, please do talk to the CRA yourself.
Yeah.
Or talk to the investment board, look up the rules, all that
exactly.
kind of stuff.
And even with sponsored posts, like, we talk about certain things. I talk about products that aren't even paying me because a lot of times people don't know that this product exists. Is it considered an endorsement? Depends on how you look at it. It's like, I don't write reviews and get paid, right? But if a client tells me hey, here's a product we're launching, can you just give your honest thoughts of how it fits into people's lifestyles, and we'll pay you for it? Yeah, I'll probably do it. And again, people may think that I won't have an objective voice for it. And maybe some people are like that, but for me, it's like, I'm very clear to being like, well, I need to know more about the product first, and then I got to see if it works, and maybe we can make a deal.
But that's a condition of a writing contract is, I'm sure you put this in. Mm-hmm. You have every right to have your opinions. Yeah. They don't tell you what to say.
That's exactly it.
And
right?
so it's not an endorsement. If you then decide to be like, yeah, I think this is a great, fantastic product, that's still your opinion.
Exactly.
It's not. They're not telling you, and they're not going to pull out just because you're like, everyone should buy this and only this.
Exactly, right? Like, I want my readers to understand, like, there's products out there that can benefit them or help them with whatever their needs. Or that could be credit card products. It could be investment products. It could even be something on Amazon.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
But these products do exist, and that's just the way it is these days. Sponsorship is becoming more and more common. You look at newspapers and they have sponsored content, and they're like, well, it's different because it's in a sponsored section, so it's not really an ad. It's like, it's apples and oranges.
It's still an ad.
Call it whatever you want,
yeah.
Right? It's just like, oh, well, we didn't write it, so it's like, and had it like, I don't care. It's like, or whatever you want. Or, some people will be like, well, I wasn't paid directly by the bank, so it doesn't count. It's like, but you're still doing work for the bank, right? It's like, it makes no sense. You can call it whatever you want.
So might as well have transparency, right?
Yeah,
and say, this was, like, they paid me some money to write an article about this, but this is all in my words, right?
Yeah, and
that's what you say.
It also depends on the situation. Like, just forget about personal finance bloggers for a second. Think about influencers or other people. Some people will do this and that and be like, oh, I never take payment. People are just getting me from me. Yeah, well, it goes back to, those days we were talking about the kids who get all the more gifts. Some people are just in a situation where they don't need to make money from pushing products.
Isn't that nice?
Right, you know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it's great. You can do whatever you want. You can travel the world. Like, you don't need to worry about it. But I still have bills to pay. So, yeah, like, how do I make money? I make money whichever way I possibly can, right? That's just the life of a freelancer.
Well, I found myself, I would tell people about Wealthsimple all the time. I'm like, because I like the product. I'm go and this is a good option for you. Go do this. If you don't like them, fine. But I think you should do this. And I'm doing it all the time. I'm like, Well, if I'm going to tell people to go there anyway, I might as well sign up for a referral program with them, or the
100%,
advisor
right?
program, so that I can actually stay with my clients and look into their money. But Wealthsimple takes care of all of the legal stuff.
I totally agree with that, but some people out there think that's completely wrong. It's like, you can't do that because now because Wealthsimple is paying you, you can't give objective advice. That being said, the Ads Standards Council just put out this big deck about how you should present yourself when it's affiliate. But if you're clear and you're disclosing that relationship, then people know.
They can make their own choices.
Exactly. That's the more important thing.
If you don't like the fact that I'm affiliated with this or that product because I like them, like, I'm not affiliated. That's the thing to note, right? It's like not affiliated with the highest paying mutual funds.
Yeah.
Like, that's a different kind of story, right? Like, these are the things that I believe, personally, that are the best products for you.
Yeah, and people don't realize that, or they do know it, and they just don't care, and they just like to pick on bloggers because like they feel like, for whatever reason. But, look how many product placements are in movies these days. Yeah. Are you going to start complaining about that? Well, how do you think that product got in there? Because they paid for it. Or why is every single major movie these days have a scene in Asia or China specifically? Because China's paying them for that.
Or 700 car commercials before in the previews.
100%, right? Like, it applies to anything, or even on television, not newscasts, but morning shows, certain shows, everything is a product placement. They've bought that spot.
The coffee or that they're drinking.
Right,
stuff
so
like
you
that
could
too.
argue that, hey, at least with bloggers, we're disclosing it, we're saying
everything.
It, right? But on certain TV shows or whatever, you might not even know it's an ad. Or
they don't have the same opportunity to say, hey, this is an ad, by the way, but these opinions are my own.
Exactly, right? It's nuts to think that.
Yeah, you're right. People will have problems, and we're fine. Like, we don't need people. I definitely don't want anyone to work with me who has a problem or read my stuff if they don't like it, or be my client if they don't want to be. Like, I'm going to be fully transparent, right? So Money We Have kept going, and then you eventually got bigger. And when did the travel blogging come in?
Well, travel was always there from the beginning.
On Money We Have, you were always starting.
Yeah, and that was really just for the reason that at the time when I started my blog, I felt like, okay, how am I going to do something different from all the other Canadian personal finance bloggers? Because there's already so many well-established people.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, you know what? I like to travel, so why don't I just share how to save money on travel? Great. So I did that as a guest post, and I just added it to my own things. And life changes, and then I just started to write about places I'd been, not necessarily about having a money angle. I still always try to have a money angle, but I just like to tell stories.
Yeah.
But to me, it's just, people like to think travel's expensive, and I don't think it needs to be. And it's not even about it being expensive. To me, it's about having a budget.
Sure.
My wife and I like to travel, so we save a decent amount every single year to travel. And my rule to her, and she agrees with it, is just like, okay, we're saving X dollars every single month. And it's going to sound crazy for some people, but we set aside almost $10,000 a year for travel.
Oh, nice.
Right? And this is before we had a kid, mind you.
Sure.
So it was a little bit easier. We didn't have, and it sounds nuts because if you think about it, it's like, oh, if we didn't travel for 5 years, that would have been an extra $50,000 we could have put towards our home down payment.
But you got to live your life.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Right.
Balance.
We had decided that's what was important to us, and the rule was, well, it wasn't always at $10,000. We scaled it up as we made more income. So I know it sounds like a lifestyle creep, but we did equal amounts to our savings.
Yeah.
But we said, it's like, okay, you know what? I'm using $10,000 as a round number now. It's just like, okay, we have $10,000 to spend this year. We can take as many vacations as we want, as long as we're under that $10,000. Yeah. And we could technically go over it, but then we have to cut from somewhere else, right? Okay. We can't just, and that doesn't necessarily mean savings, right? It's like, oh, we'll cut from savings.
Yeah.
No. It's like, okay, we're going to, drive less. Maybe we'll take transit.
Or eat out less.
Exactly, right? So that's the way we looked at it. And it's worked out very well, but now with the daughter, costs go up significantly. And
she's the travel fund now.
Not that she's a travel fund, but it's more like, well, she is, I guess you could think about it that way. Because those are expenses we didn't have before.
Yeah, that's right.
So it was easy to save X amount before, but now we have to have so many other expenses to factor in. And like I said, I took a pay cut, and we knew that going in. So yeah, it affects savings, but it affects everything else too. I can't cut my grocery bill much lower. In fact, my grocery bill's gone up, obviously, because I've got a child to feed.
You got an extra mouth.
Right? But I did cut back on travel a little bit. And I'm in a fortunate situation also where I write about travel, so sometimes I work with partners, but even then, it's just like, there's always work involved. It's not necessarily free.
It's time away from your family, too.
Well, it's also time away from doing my actual job, right?
Yeah, well, that too, exactly.
Yeah, so there's everything has a cost associated with it, but we look to maximize value on travel, like what destinations are cheaper. If you see a flight deal, can we make it work? Can we sail with friends for family? Can we use points from our credit cards to reduce the amount of travel, blah, blah, blah. So you use what tools are available to you and do what you can, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so the Money We Have and the travel blogging, that's still going, but you're maybe doing a little bit less now?
I've just had to cut back on my personal blogging, but at the same time, it's funny because I quit my TV job. I need to make more money, so I'm technically freelancing more, like writing. So you could argue that I'm doing more. My focus has just shifted. Honestly, I'd like to probably scale back even more.
But people can find you all over the internet.
That's right. Yeah,
you've written for a whole bunch of different publications, websites, banks, stuff like that.
MoneySense, Tangerine, PC Financial. I write for just about everyone. I do hosting. I'm on TV. Yeah, I do everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you have some really good video content now. I've been seeing lately. And so moneywehave.com.
That's right.
That's the primary place to find you. Is there another place?
You can find me Twitter at Barry Choi.
At Barry Choi. So this is Barry Choi, moneywehave.com. Thanks for having me up here in this billiards room. This is great.
Anytime.
Yeah, I like it. And thanks for being so friendly to me when we first met and welcoming me into the community. And I really feel like I'm part of the club. And
you are.
I finally got you on the show, which is good. Great. Thanks, Barry.
Anytime.
If you like this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. It would mean a lot to me, and it only takes a few seconds. As I said at the start of the episode, the Personal Finance Show is currently without sponsors, for now. Until then, to help me keep the show running, I ask that you please visit my other sites, financialaccounting.ca and awesomedeals.ca. And if you want to know more about me, you can read my full story at beauhumphreys.com, including links to all of my websites. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Personal Finance Show. Next week, my guest will be Gordon Stein, author of Cash Flow Cookbook, $2 Million of Financial Freedom in 60 Easy Recipes.